The sun had just begun to rise when I discovered the gate firmly locked, my crops enclosed like creatures in a zoo, and Emily, the HOA president, parading around my property as if it belonged to her. You might be curious about how I ended up in this situation and why that confident expression on Emily's face would soon freeze in terror once she realized I had purchased the land and held the only key to the gate she had just locked. The very first time I laid eyes on the fence, I suspected it might be some kind of joke. It was early morning, with the air still thick with dew, as I pulled up in my worn-out old pickup truck and saw the fence standing tall like an unsightly wound on the land. 6 feet high, chain link topped with sharp, shiny coils of barbed wire that caught the sunlight like blades. It enclosed my entire crop field. What used to be an open space of carefully cultivated corn and tomatoes was now trapped like a high-security prison. A bright orange sign fluttered in the wind reading Community Improvement Project. No trespassing. I remember standing there for what felt like an eternity, one hand clenched tightly on the truck door, the other gripping my coffee thermos so hard I feared it would break. My farm had stood for 3 generations, long before developers carved out their flawless cul-de-sacs and matching mailboxes on the surrounding hills. I was part of this land, a stubborn old tree with roots sunk deep in the earth. For a while I hoped that would keep me safe. But Emily, oh no, Emily Mitchell, the newly appointed president of the Willowbrook HOA, had different plans. I marched directly to the fence line where a group of arrogant men in reflective vests were still tightening bolts and pouring concrete. "What exactly is this?" I demanded. One of them barely glanced up from his clipboard, mumbling something about HOA guidelines and beautification requirements. When I questioned under whose authority they were erecting a fence across my crops, they just vaguely pointed toward the elegant clubhouse at the hill's summit. I didn't hesitate. I stormed into the HOA office where Emily sat behind her large desk, typing away on her laptop as if launching missiles rather than composing emails. "It is for the benefit of the community," she said sweetly when I confronted her. Her tone had that syrupy insincerity you only hear from people about to do something truly unpleasant. Your farmland, while historic, no longer matches the aesthetic standards of Willowbrook. The board voted unanimously to put up a visual barrier. A visual barrier? As if my family's hard work, sweat, and calluses were some kind of sickness that needed to be quarantined, I argued. Naturally, I argued. I explained that I was grandfathered in according to the original zoning laws, that my land had been agricultural long before their HOA rules were dreamed up by some overpaid lawyer. Emily just grinned wider. That kind of smile you see on those who believe they have already won remain free to challenge the ruling, she said cheerfully, sliding a thick stack of documents across the desk. At the same time, penalties for failing to comply would accumulate each day. Ignoring rules about growing food on the property was not an option. I accepted the papers and left silently, fully aware that the appeal process was meaningless. These people played by no fair rules. They had no respect for laws, heritage, or logic. Their focus was on control, on property values, and on preserving the picture-perfect streets shown in the brochures they clutched at every community meeting. Initially, I tried to remain polite, writing letters, organizing gatherings, and even hiring a local attorney who specialized in property disputes, hoping that perhaps sense might prevail. Emily responded by increasing the fines twofold. Then she sent new warnings accusing me of unauthorized land use and failing to keep the landscaping up to standard. Although my rows of corn were neater and better maintained than many lawns around the neighborhood, the letters poured in relentlessly, each one marked with urgent red deadlines and threats of court proceedings. At night, I noticed the community security patrols, bright white SUVs slowly cruising past my locked gates, their headlights sweeping over the crops like searchlights. Everyone knew they wanted me out. Once, I overheard Emily and her close associates at the gas station laughing about how much my little farm was depressing property prices in the area. Values, and how incredible it would all be once I was no longer involved. What they did not realize, what they could never have imagined, was that I had been preparing for this moment for many years. From the very first sign of trouble when the Willowbrook development pushed right up to the edge of my land, I had been quietly taking action, updating property deeds, researching easements, and speaking with longtime residents at the county clerk's office who knew the old land grants better than anyone else. I spent countless hours in the town library studying fragile, yellowed maps and dusty court records while others bickered over trivial neighborhood disputes. Every fine they issued, every petty warning I wrote down and kept, every lie they spread, every overstep I recorded. I was not just defending my property anymore. I was methodically building my case, piece by piece, paper by paper, waiting for them to slip up and create the opening I needed. And if they thought a simple fence would drive me away, they had no clue what kind of storm they were about to unleash. Nevertheless, the fence was a real issue, immediate and practical, because my tractors could no longer get through. I had to either climb over it or crawl underneath just to access the fields. It was degrading, watching my family's hard work become nothing more than a locked display for the HOA's privileged members to gawk at while riding their golf carts. They installed cameras on every corner, claiming it was for safety, but in truth, it was just to keep the farmer locked in his place. One afternoon, I saw Emily giving a tour to a group of prospective homeowners, gesturing at my crops as if they were some charming historical exhibit. "Of course, we are working on updating the area," she said loudly, casting me a victorious look while I stood there, drenched in sweat and furious under the blazing midday sun. Eventually, this whole space would become community green areas, gardens, parks, maybe even a dog park. That was when I realized with complete certainty that they intended to take everything. Not only to fence me in, not only to crush my spirit, but to push me off the land entirely. The worst part was knowing that most of the neighborhood would probably celebrate when it happened. They wanted their perfect paradise, their tidy little world free of the trouble farmers bring, dirt, and anything outside of HOA rules. I spent many long evenings sitting on the porch, staring at the ugly fence stretching across the horizon, pondering my next step. To me, there were only two options. I could give up, sell out for whatever meager amount they would offer once they bankrupted me with fines, and vanish as they wished. Or I could finish what I had begun. I picked the latter. If they wanted a fight, that was what they would get. Not with fists, lawsuits, or shouting matches at meetings, but with patience, careful paperwork, and strategy. The way to defeat a snake is not by struggling with it directly, but by cutting off its oxygen and waiting for it to suffocate on its own. The first move was to let them believe they were winning, allowing Emily to roam freely with her clipboard and her confident little grin, convinced she had trapped the powerful farmer. Because when the moment arrived, when the gate clicked shut behind her and the lock snapped firmly, I wanted her to recall that very smile. I wanted her to realize just how terribly she had underestimated me. Every single morning after that moment, I made a deliberate show of inspecting the fence, running my fingers along the chain link, checking the locks, and nodding with approval, as if I was thankful for their craftsmanship. I attended every HOA meeting, sitting quietly at the back, taking notes while they praised themselves for upholding community standards. I paid the fines, only minor ones, just enough to keep them thinking I was cooperating. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I was maneuvering the real moves, contacting surveyors, obtaining title reports, uncovering every crack and loophole they had carelessly left while rushing to seize control of the surrounding land. If Emily and her clipboard brigade believed they were dealing with a stubborn old farmer, they were about to realize that what they had actually trapped was a wolf, and wolves, once cornered, never retreat. They strike for the throat. While Emily and her little realm busied themselves congratulating each other for boxing me in, the fight had only just begun. While they clashed openly, raising fences and citing violations for all to see, I was quietly widening the battlefield. Their fight was loud and visible, but mine happened in the shadows, moving carefully through dusty archives of county documents, quietly negotiating deals with men whose hands matched my own in roughness and determination. Most people believed Willowbrook ended exactly where the HOA boundaries were drawn, neat lines featured in their polished brochures. Yet the true boundaries and history lay hidden in land grants far older than anyone imagined, dating back to when this area was nothing more than dirt lanes and cattle paths. The original planners had been clever, but not perfect. They had created easements, maintenance rights, and small strips of land ownership that were forgotten as neighborhoods expanded. Easements for utility cables, unrecorded dirt access roads, small runoff drainage zones required by county law to remain clear. These were tiny flaws in what the HOA saw as an unbreakable fortress, and those cracks were exactly where I planned to pry it apart until the entire structure collapsed. It all began with a simple handshake agreement with Old Man Jenkins, who still legally owned the 10-foot strip of dirt road serving as the back entrance to the HOA's so-called private clubhouse parking. Jenkins had moved 2 towns away and cared little for Willowbrook beyond collecting the occasional rent check from the HOA. When I showed him the original survey maps and clarified their true purpose, along with how his land was actually being used, he was eager to sell it to me cheaply, just to spite Emily and her group. After that, I acted quickly. I located a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who still held mineral rights beneath a large portion of the eastern properties. According to an old clause in the Willowbrook Charter, those mineral rights could be leveraged to enforce underground access. I purchased those rights as well. Piece by piece, property by property, I began weaving together a network that surrounded the very core of Willowbrook. Most of the time, I employed shell companies and silent investors to avoid having my name appear on any documents. There was no need to alarm the HOA so soon. A cousin here, a fellow church member there, a retired comrade who owed me a favor from our military days. They all acquired small, overlooked plots that no one else cared about anymore. When the moment came, each of them transferred ownership directly to my holding trust. The biggest victory came when I realized that the land beneath the HOA office itself, the modest stucco building where Emily held her makeshift court, was actually held under a long-term lease rather than outright ownership. This lease was set to expire in less than a year. The original owner had passed away, and the land reverted to his heir, a distant cousin who disliked HOAs and had to cover costly divorce expenses. When I offered him money with no conditions, he was nearly brought to tears by relief. I sealed the deal. The agreement was finalized in less than a fortnight. The paperwork was submitted so quietly that it barely caused a stir. The Willowbrook Homeowners Association was now holding its meetings, issuing violation notices, and sending threats on land it did not truly own. Land that in a matter of months I could force them off, without even a warning. Each signature I gathered was like a final blow to Emily's position. Every hidden clause I discovered added another link to the chain that would encircle the entire corrupt system and drag it down into the mud where it belonged. I worked late nights and weekends preparing documents, driving out to meet elderly farmers, widows, and landlords who lived elsewhere. Ironically, Emily and her supporters helped me more than they harmed me. Every time they issued a new fine or sent another arrogant letter threatening legal action, it provided me with cover and made me appear desperate and weak, like the man about to lose rather than the one constructing the noose. They never anticipated this. They were too absorbed playing rulers of the cul-de-sac, too focused on measuring grass length and tallying Christmas lights, to notice that the foundation beneath their perfectly kept paradise was quietly shifting. Just as water seeks the lowest point, power finds the weak spots. The more they pushed, the more neighbors they drove away. People who had once agreed with Emily's talks about community values started complaining over backyard fences and during late-evening drinks. I listened carefully and took notes. When the moment was perfect, I quietly made small proposals. A slight easement here, a maintenance right there. It was never about the large pieces. The importance lay in the tiny details. The strategy to dismantle a stronghold is not by crashing through the main gate. Instead, it involves digging tunnels beneath until the walls collapse inward. By the time spring arrived, I had acquired or controlled more than 60% of the land Willowbrook relied on for essential access, roads, drainage, upkeep, easements, and even the narrow pathway connecting their upscale community pool to the main water supply. This land had been hidden, fragmented across many names and trusts, but now it was all unified and neatly secured under a holding company with a name no one recognized, backed by a lawyer unwilling to relent. I even succeeded in obtaining the old maintenance depot, a stout concrete building where the homeowners association kept their landscaping tools. Apparently, it had been foreclosed years ago, and the bank was eager to sell it off for a fraction of its value. On the day the deal was finalized, I drove past slowly just to see if anyone noticed. Emily was standing in the parking lot, clipboard in hand, scolding a landscaping crew for hedge trimming violations. She looked up as my truck passed by with a rumble, frowning at the dust I stirred. I smiled and tipped my hat. She had no clue. Not yet, but the countdown had begun. I had circled the date on my calendar in bright red letters. Renewal Day, the day the Homeowners Association's lease on their cherished clubhouse ended, was the moment I would step in, documents in hand, and flip the situation so drastically they would be completely disoriented. Until that time I remained silent, paid my minor penalties, nodded politely at meetings, and allowed them to believe they had the upper hand. After all, what was one farmer against the power of a whole neighborhood group? Just a man with soil-stained hands and an unyielding stubbornness, someone they had underestimated from the beginning. That, more than anything else, turned out to be their greatest error. Because when you trap a man like me, fence him in, and prod him relentlessly, you better be certain he doesn't know how to bring everything crashing down around you. And I was only warming up. Everything reached a boiling point on a hot Saturday afternoon when Emily decided to use what she clearly believed was her strongest move. For months, she had been bragging throughout the neighborhood, acting as if she already owned my property, flaunting the fence like a prize she had earned solely through a sense of entitlement. The fines kept increasing, each one more absurd than the last. One week I was fined for inappropriate soil color, the next for unauthorized farming activities. Emily's supporters on the board approved every violation she brought forward, each carefully targeted to wear me down into giving up. But I endured it all with a smile. I smiled when they took pictures of me working in the fields. I smiled when they tried to send city inspectors, who quietly left, shaking their heads after seeing the documents I always kept in my truck. I smiled again when Emily announced at the recent HOA meeting that they had secured a permanent management plan for the farmland, which meant they now officially controlled access to the fenced area. That day, she pulled out a gleaming brass key during the meeting, holding it up as if she had just won a beauty contest. "The board will have exclusive access to the community fencing area from now on," she declared, her tone thick with smug confidence. For the safety and visual standards of Willowbrook, no one outside the board is allowed inside the fenced perimeter without prior permission. The audience actually applauded. I sat quietly near the back, nodding politely, and biting the inside of my cheek so hard I almost drew blood. What Emily did not realize, what no one in that room knew, was that 2 days before her big reveal, I had finalized the deals that changed everything. I now owned it all, every inch. The field, the access roads, the parking rights, even the small patch of land where their miserable fence posts were anchored. I had spent months carefully navigating the legal maze, unraveling decades of sloppy paperwork and careless assumptions until there was no longer any doubt. Their entire so-called community improvement plan was now fully situated on my property. The most thrilling part was that they were completely unaware they were about to lose everything they believed was firmly in their hands. The real event unfolded the next weekend when Emily decided to organize a photo opportunity. She named it a community beautification celebration, distributed flyers to every household, rented an inflatable bounce house for the children, and hired a photographer from the local newspaper to capture her victory over the unsightly farm. I caught wind of it through the same rumor mill that had supplied me with gossip for years. Only this time, I welcomed the chatter. Let her make a big deal out of it. Let her invite the entire neighborhood. Having more spectators only made it more entertaining. That morning, the entire town of Willowbrook seemed alive with anticipation. Golf carts paraded down the streets decorated with balloons. Children played tag across the immaculately tended lawns. Emily herself appeared in a pristine white pantsuit and an enormous sun hat, embodying the queen surveying her conquered land. She wore the brass key on a sparkling gold chain around her neck, stopping to flaunt it to anyone who inquired. By 11 o'clock, the crowd began to gather at the entrance. Emily led the way, followed by a flock of HOA board members and devoted supporters trailing behind her like ducklings. She delivered a brief address about community pride, resilience, and how they had reclaimed the farmland for the common good. Cameras flashed, phones recorded. This was exactly the moment she had envisioned. Then she stepped forward, waved the key with flair, and slid it into the padlock on the gate. It did not turn. Emily frowned, jiggled the key more forcefully. Still nothing. Whispering spread through the crowd. She tried again, her face flushing as she twisted and pulled. No luck. At last, she turned to one of the maintenance workers, muttering something quietly. He clumsily searched through a large ring of keys, trying 2 more. The gate stood firm. That was when I moved out from the crowd. I wore my old worn-out boots and work jeans, spotted with dust and stains, just like they always were when I was doing actual labor instead of posing for photos. In my hand was a thick bunch of folded papers that made a heavy sound against my palm as I walked across the street toward the gate. "Trouble, Emily?" I asked loud enough for everyone to hear. She spun around, a forced smile fixed on her face. "There appears to be an issue with the lock," she said through clenched teeth. Emily's eyes narrowed sharply. "That gate belongs to the homeowners association," she snapped. "You are trespassing." I laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was a deep, hearty laugh, born from months of anticipation for this very moment. "Trespassing?" I said, shaking my head. "Emily, darling, this land belongs to me. Always has. The only change is that now I own the easements too, along with the clubhouse lot, and, oh yes, the territory this fence is standing on." I handed the documents to the maintenance worker, who took them automatically, blinking as if stunned by a sudden blow. "These are certified deeds, recorded and filed with the county. If you doubt me, feel free to verify their authenticity with the registrar's office. I made sure they have copies ready." Silence settled over the crowd. The maintenance worker stepped back nervously. The board members clustered together like a flock caught in a storm. Emily stood firm, though her legs were visibly trembling. "You are lying," she said, her voice sharp and fragile. "This is a trick." "No, it is not," I replied cheerfully as I stepped forward to unlock the gate. It swung open with a satisfying creak. "This," I said, gesturing them inside, "is private property. You all are trespassing right now, and if you do not leave within the next 5 minutes, I will call the sheriff's department to explain the situation." Some of the wiser ones began to back away at once. Mrs. Carter from Maple Lane grabbed her children and hurried off. The local newspaper photographer lowered his camera, looking uncertain. Emily stood frozen, her knuckles white around a useless brass key. "You cannot do this," she whispered. "I already have," I said, smiling at her. "And just to be absolutely clear, any further use of HOA funds to maintain or access this property will be considered embezzlement and criminal trespass. I have already submitted preliminary notices to the county, so if anyone feels like pushing their luck, challenge me if you wish. Go right ahead." For a long moment, no one made a move. Then Emily let the key fall. It rattled on the pavement, small and insignificant now, a mere piece of brass representing everything she had lost. She turned around and strode back up the street, her little group following silently in shame. I watched them leave, leaning casually against the open gate, savoring every thrilling second. When they disappeared, I faced the remaining crowd, the ordinary people who just wanted a peaceful place to live without being caught up in someone else's ego. I nodded politely and said, "Feel free to enjoy the view. This is still a functioning farm after all. Just pick the tomatoes." Some chuckled nervously and a few even applauded. Suddenly the balance of power shifted. The HOA board was no longer untouchable. They had become just another group of bullies who chose a battle they could not win. That night I changed every lock, installed new fencing along the access roads I now owned, and placed bright shiny signs every 20 feet stating private property, no trespassing violators will be prosecuted. I even had some fun with one particular sign right opposite the clubhouse entrance. "Smile, you are trespassing on farmer property." Emily tried to resist naturally, filing complaints and threatening lawsuits, but it was too late. The law was firmly on my side. The deeds were flawless. Every petty tactic they tried was just futile. They only buried themselves deeper into the trouble they had eagerly started months earlier. And me? I kept working the land, kept smiling, kept refining the important key that truly mattered. The one that unlocked every gate, every door, every path they had once attempted to block. They thought they had trapped me, but in reality I had locked them out. Now the land belonged to me again, open and unrestricted, just as it always should have been. The weeks following the Great Gate fiasco unfolded more rapidly than I could have imagined, like a slow, burning blaze finally reaching a dry forest and speeding toward the horizon. The shock from Emily's embarrassment at the fence spread throughout Willowbrook like a raging wildfire. People who once clutched their HOA rule books as if they were holy scrolls now crossed the street to avoid any chance of being seen speaking with her. Board meetings became sparsely attended. Rumors and whispers grew louder. It did not take long for the other repercussions to begin falling like a series of dominoes. First came the realization that the HOA could not legally maintain half of their so-called community amenities without crossing my property. The clubhouse parking lot, the pool filtering station, and even the small pocket park with its overpriced playground equipment. Each one was accessible only by roads and easements I now controlled, and I was not feeling very generous. I sent certified letters to the HOA board detailing new terms for usage. They were allowed to continue using the facilities, of course, but only at a cost. an incredibly generous price. My attorney, a tenacious woman named Claire, who had spent her entire career defending farmers against land seizures, ensured every contract was flawless. Expenses for maintenance vehicles, toll fees, landscaping teams, permit applications, community events, and rental agreements all added up. Each action resulted in yet another payment made to my holding company. Within 2 months, the HOA Reserve Fund, once proudly touted in quarterly newsletters as a beacon of financial responsibility, was completely depleted simply to cover basic costs like mowing the lawns and emptying the clubhouse trash bins. Meanwhile, the residents, many of whom had been misled by Emily's charming words and promises of a real estate paradise, began raising difficult questions. Why were their association fees soaring while services worsened? Why was the clubhouse inaccessible on weekends? Why was the swimming pool closed for repairs during the hottest summer in years? Tensions came to a boil at the following general meeting when a group of angry homeowners demanded Emily explain the situation. I sat quietly in the back, arms folded, relishing every moment as she faltered and sweated under the harsh fluorescent lights, having abandoned her signature sun hat for a serious navy suit that failed to conceal her fear. Things deteriorated further when Claire, standing at the back of the room, politely introduced herself and revealed to everyone that Willowbrook HOA had been managing private property without any legal authorization. For more than a year, every single dollar they had spent on maintaining the facilities became subject to reimbursement claims. The pending lawsuits on our part guaranteed this outcome. Emily attempted to shift the blame, pointing fingers at other board members, but they were not deceived. People sense when a situation is collapsing. The members turned against her quicker than a blink of an eye. Within 7 days, Emily stepped down as president, citing health issues, and withdrew behind the locked gates of her large home at the top of Maple Lane. However, even that refuge did not hold. With the Homeowners Association incapacitated and unable to cover basic maintenance costs, property prices began to fall. News spread beyond Willowbrook about the lawsuit, the disorder, and the mismanagement. Potential buyers stayed away, while sellers grew anxious. Homeowners Association Management International, the firm responsible for overseeing Willowbrook's finances, severed ties abruptly after evaluating the looming liabilities. Without unified management, Willowbrook broke apart into bitter groups of angry residents, each blaming another for the chaos. Emily's own property, the one she had admired for years like a trophy on display, was among the first to be put up for sale. It was listed far below market value but attracted no interest. A neighbor revealed that she even attempted to sell it to some of the developers she had previously lured with promises of growth and beautification. They mocked her and refused the offer. During the summer, facing foreclosure and rapidly increasing legal expenses, Emily was forced into a desperate sale. Her grand McMansion, featuring marble countertops and imported hardwood flooring, was sold for less than she had paid 10 years before, and she left Willowbrook in the dead of night. Her moving van groaned beneath the weight of shattered pride and dashed hopes. As for me, I refused to simply relax and enjoy the win. I had aspirations. I wanted more than to survive. I aimed to create something better and enduring. It began with the old fields, once enclosed like a zoo display. I dismantled the chain-link fence with my own hands, panel by panel, stacking the mangled metal to be removed as scrap. I replaced it by planting rows of vibrant wildflowers along the edge, native varieties that burst across the landscape in shimmering gold, purple, and red. I cultivated the soil and revived the old produce stands like my grandfather had run before, where local families could purchase fresh tomatoes, corn, squash, and peppers picked that very morning. The empty clubhouse, once a symbol of HOA pride, I purchased at an auction when the bankrupt association had no choice but to sell. I transformed it into a community market. Farmers from nearby counties brought their produce, artisans set up stalls, and food trucks arrived on Saturdays. This became the very heart of Willowbrook, the place they had tried to erase. Enclosed and demolished once, the area now pulses with energy, vibrant hues, and bustling trade. Near the entrance, where the old sign proudly announced Willowbrook as a planned community, I placed a new monument. It stood 10 feet tall, crafted from iron and bronze, visible from half a mile along the country road. A rooster, bold and unyielding, with wings partially spread, held a large brass key firmly in its beak. At the statue's base, a polished plaque gleamed brightly, inscribed for Emily, who lost everything over a fence. The monument soon became a beloved local landmark. Visitors often stopped to snap photos, laughing at its oddity and admiring the skilled workmanship. Students from the high school art program decorated the adjacent walls with murals depicting farmland and open skies, free from fences and homeowners association notices. Tourists from nearby towns came for the farmers' market and left, telling tales about the rooster and the man who defied the system. For me, however, the statue, market, and even the triumph were never the core of it all. It was about what the land symbolized: freedom, diligence, and a community based not on rules from petty tyrants, but on trust, handshakes, and the simple kindness of neighbors watching out for each other. Each dawn, I strolled the property, boots crunching gravel paths, golden fields stretching out full of hope. Passing the statue, I tipped my hat to that towering iron rooster, a quiet homage to a hard-fought battle. There were battles fought during that time, and occasionally, just occasionally, when the wind was calm and the early morning light caught the brass key in a certain way, I could almost catch Emily's voice drifting softly on the breeze. It was filled with frustration, still struggling to find a way to open a door that had been shut to her forever. But by then, the key had slipped from her grasp, out of everyone's reach except mine. And I intended to keep it that way, serving as a symbol that sometimes the barriers we create to confine others end up trapping ourselves instead. I rested against the porch railing, a steaming cup of strong coffee in my hand, watching the sun rise over the vast fields, feeling the deep, steady rhythm of the earth beneath my boots. This was my land, my rules. No barriers were necessary. Just endless open space and a future as bright and untamed as the rooster crowing from its iron perch.